The smell reached her before anything else. Not blood, though this castle had seen plenty of that over the centuries. Not the cold damp you get in old stone buildings, or the leftover scent of candle wax. This was something else entirely. Something older than all of that. Something she couldn't name, and Saren knew a lot of languages, so that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She pressed her back flat against the corridor wall and focused on breathing like a normal person. 3 weeks ago, she had been sitting in a university basement in Edinburgh, translating old medical manuscripts. Quiet work. Dry work. The kind of work most people fall asleep thinking about. Occasionally, something interesting would turn up. A passage that didn't quite match what the history books said, and that would keep her going for another week. Her supervisor said she was obsessive. Her flatmate said she was boring. Her mother called every Sunday without fail and asked, in that particular tone mothers have, when Saren planned to build a life that involved at least some fresh air and daylight. None of them knew what she had actually found in those manuscripts. Coordinates. She hadn't known either, until the third one. Until the pattern emerged in the marginalia, those tiny scribbled notes in the borders that most researchers ignored because they assumed they were decorative. Saren had been copying them out of habit, filling a separate notebook with the fragments, when she noticed the numbers embedded in what looked like Latin prayers. She should have told someone. She knew that now, standing in this corridor in a castle that didn't appear on any map she'd ever accessed, holding a bag with one change of clothes and a notebook full of translations that had apparently led her here instead of to the academic conference she'd told everyone she was attending. The smell intensified. There was a door at the end of the corridor. Heavy oak, iron hinges, the kind of door that belonged in a museum display about medieval architecture. It was slightly open. The gap was perhaps 3 inches wide, and from it came a thin thread of light that was not quite golden and not quite white, but something uncomfortably in between. Saren told herself to go back the way she'd come. Her feet carried her forward instead. She had always had this problem. Her brain would issue perfectly sensible instructions, and her body would simply decline to follow them, particularly when there was something interesting on the other side of a door. Her therapist, back when she'd had time for one, had called it an approach motivation issue. Saren had called it curiosity. The distinction felt academic right now. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was enormous and almost entirely dark except for a fireplace that shouldn't have been burning, given that no one had lit it in what the dust suggested was a very long time. The fire cast long shadows across stone floors, across walls hung with tapestries so old the figures on them had faded to suggestions. There were bookshelves. Of course there were bookshelves. She registered them with the specific pleasure of someone who cannot help themselves, and then she registered the figure sitting in the chair nearest the fire. He was very still. That was the first thing, the absolute quality of his stillness. The way he sat without any of the small unconscious movements that living things made, the slight shift of weight, the micro-adjustment of posture, the almost invisible rhythm of breathing. He sat like something carved, like something that had decided stillness was a choice, and had been making that choice for a very long time. He was looking at her. She couldn't see his eyes clearly from the doorway. The firelight was behind him, which meant his face was in shadow, which meant she was getting an impression more than a clear view. Dark hair, broad shoulders, the kind of posture that didn't come from good breeding, but from something older than breeding as a concept. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. His voice was low and completely unhurried, like someone who had never once felt the need to rush a sentence in their life. The accent was strange, old, not quite anything she could place, which was saying something given that she could usually identify a regional dialect within 4 or 5 sentences. Saren, opened her mouth. What came out was, the marginalia in the third manuscript used a substitution cipher based on the Voynich alphabet. I wasn't trying to find you. I was following the coordinates academically. A pause. That, he said, is an unusual thing to say when breaking into someone's home. I didn't break in. The door was unlocked. She hesitated. The front door, and the gate, and the side entrance. Everything was unlocked, actually, which in retrospect was probably not a coincidence. No, he agreed. It wasn't. She should have been more frightened than she was. She was aware of this. She was experiencing something that registered as fear, the elevated heart rate, the hyper-awareness. The way the light in the room seemed too sharp at the edges, but underneath it was something that felt embarrassingly like recognition. Like she had read a description of this room in something she'd forgotten, and the reality of it was confirming the memory rather than shocking her with its strangeness. "You're him," she said, "the one the manuscripts are about." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way you looked at something you'd been waiting for and weren't entirely sure how to feel about now that it had arrived. "Sarah Nadley," he said. "Not a question. You know my name. I've known your name for considerably longer than you've known mine." The fire popped. A log shifted. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the castle's thick walls, something called out in a language that was definitely not any bird she'd ever heard. "What are you?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. He finally moved, just his head, tilting slightly. "Sit down," he said. "This will take some time to explain." She didn't sit down immediately. That would have felt like surrendering something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. Instead, she stood in the doorway for another few seconds, taking in the room with the methodical attention she applied to everything, cataloging details the way she cataloged marginalia, not because she expected to need them, but because her brain simply refused to let things go unnoticed. The bookshelves were real, floor to ceiling on 2 walls, and the books on them were not decorative. They had the slightly irregular look of actually used books, spines at different angles, some leaning, some with slips of paper marking pages. Several were open on a low table near the fire, weighted flat with smooth stones. She couldn't read the titles from here, but the scripts were varied. She could see what looked like Arabic, something Cyrillic, something that might have been early Norse runes. The man in the chair watched her notice all of this, and said nothing. She came into the room properly, and sat in the chair across from him, which put the firelight between them, which meant she could finally see his face. She had been expecting something wrong. Something that would signal immediately and unmistakably that this person was not what he appeared. The uncanny valley effect that people described. The sense of something almost human, but not quite landing. What she got instead was a face that was simply exact. That was the only word that fit. High cheekbones. A jaw that looked like someone had made architectural decisions about it. Dark eyes that were currently the color of amber, but had a quality of depth to them that didn't match the shallow distance between his iris and whatever was behind it. Long dark hair tied back simply. A scar that ran from his left temple to just below his cheekbone, old and silver white, healed so completely it was more like a memory of an injury than an injury itself. He looked. She thought with the part of her brain that refused to be appropriate even in extremis, like someone had taken the concept of a king seriously, and then continued past the point where most people stopped. "You're a vampire," she said. "Yes, the manuscripts refer to you as the Ashwalker. Because of what your bite does to people." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, barely enough to register. But it was there. "That is one of the names," he said. "The manuscripts say you're 900 years old. 943. A pause. Give or take a decade. Record-keeping was inconsistent in the 11th century. And the bite thing. She folded her hands in her lap, mainly to stop them from doing something revealing. That's real? Everyone you've bitten has died, he said. Flat, final, not defensive, which was somehow worse than if he'd been defensive. Yes, Saren absorbed this information. How many people? She asked. Saren, I'm not asking to judge you. I'm asking because if I'm going to understand what the manuscripts are describing, I need to know the scope of what we're talking about. He looked at her for a long moment. Seven people in 900 years. I stopped trying after the third. He said it like someone stating a practical fact, like I stopped eating that particular food after it made me ill 3 times. The bite is not controllable. It is not a matter of strength or technique or the donor's physical health. I have bitten 7 people across 9 centuries, and all 7 are dead. The last one was in 1987, and she was 24 years old, and she had just finished her doctorate. He stopped. I don't try anymore. The fire settled. The room felt suddenly smaller. But you brought me here, Saren said slowly. Yes, through the manuscripts. Yes, which means you think I'm different. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her in that particular way again. The one that felt like assessment combined with something that wasn't quite hope, but was in the same general neighborhood. Something careful and controlled and old enough that it had learned not to show itself clearly. The wound in my side has not healed in 943 years, he said. A wound inflicted by a weapon that was created specifically to kill my kind. It should have killed me. It did not. But it has not closed either, and over the centuries the consequences of carrying that wound have become he stopped. Started again differently. The manuscripts were written by a physician in the 14th century who believed she had identified a cure. She died before she could complete her research. I have been looking for the continuation of her work for 700 years. The marginalia, Saren said. She hid the rest of her notes in the margins of texts she knew would survive. She trusted that someone with the right mind would eventually find them and follow the sequence to its conclusion. And the conclusion is me. The conclusion, he said carefully, is your blood. According to everything she wrote, your specific blood, a specific genetic marker that emerges perhaps once every 3 or 4 generations, is the only thing that can close a wound made by that particular weapon. Not heal it. Close it. End the bleeding that has been happening slowly and invisibly for nearly 1,000 years. Saren was quiet for a moment. And you need to bite me to find out if she was right. Yes, which might kill me. I don't know, he said, and the honesty in it was startling. That is the truth. I don't know. Every other person I have bitten has died. The physician believed you would not. I cannot promise you she was correct. Saren looked at the fire. She thought about Edinburgh, and the basement, and the manuscripts, and the 3 weeks of obsessive translation that had led her here. She thought about her mother's Sunday phone calls, and her supervisor's concern, and her flatmate saying she was boring. She thought, well, this is certainly something. What's your name? She asked. Another pause, as if he had not been asked this in long enough that the question required retrieval from somewhere deep. Calum, he said. Calum, she tried it. It fit his face somehow. How long have you been in this castle? 200 years. More or less. Do you have food? For humans, I mean. It was a long drive. For the first time, something crossed his face that was almost not quite, but almost amusement. Yes, he said. I have food. He fed her in the kitchen. This was not what she'd expected. She had half imagined being handed something formal and cold in that enormous firelit room, a tray perhaps, something that communicated clearly that this was a transaction and not a meal. Instead, Calum led her through a low corridor into a kitchen that was bewilderingly functional. Modern appliances that looked strange against stone walls. A refrigerator. An actual kettle. "You have a kettle," she said. "I have had guests before." He opened the refrigerator with the particular care of someone who had learned by watching rather than by needing, the way you could tell when someone had grown up in a different era, because they were always slightly too deliberate about ordinary objects. Not recently. She sat at the kitchen table, which was old wood and enormous, the kind that had probably had 30 people around it at some point in its history, and now mostly held a single mug and a folded newspaper dated 3 weeks ago. She noticed the date and filed it away. He put bread and cheese and cold meat on a board and set it in front of her without ceremony. She ate. She was genuinely hungry, it turned out, hunger having apparently decided this was not the moment to be polite and absent itself. Calum sat across from her and did not eat, which made sense, and did not make it feel weird, which was a talent. "Tell me about the wound," she said between bites. "What kind of weapon?" "Specifically designed," he said, "by someone who understood what my kind were. Not the general myths we are not harmed by sunlight or religious symbols. Garlic is simply unpleasant, and crosses have never done anything except remind us of a particular period of history that most of us prefer not to revisit. But whoever made this weapon understood the actual mechanics of what we are. It was designed to wound without killing, specifically to cause a slow drain of." He paused. "There's no word in any modern language that covers it accurately. The closest is vitality, but that sounds like something from a 19th century wellness pamphlet. It drains you. Slowly, yes, over centuries, not decades, which is why I am still here and still functional. But the rate has been increasing for the past 100 years or so, and the physician's notes suggested it would reach a critical threshold at approximately." He stopped. "When?" Saren asked. She was imprecise about dates, but her description of the symptoms correlates with what I have been experiencing for the past several years. Saren set down the bread. "You're running out of time." "Possibly. And you've been looking for me for someone with this blood marker for 700 years. Yes, she thought about that. 700 years of searching for a person. 700 years of following threads through historical records and manuscripts and marginalia written by a dead physician who had apparently been both brilliant and extraordinarily careful about what she committed to directly readable text. Why did she hide it?" Saren asked. "The physician. Why not just write it plainly?" Calum was quiet for a moment, because what she had discovered was dangerous knowledge. A cure implies that the wound was deliberate, and a deliberate wound implies that someone wanted me incapacitated without killing me, which leads to questions about who and why that she was not equipped to answer safely. So she scattered the information, left it in pieces that only someone with a specific combination of knowledge and inclination would think to assemble. "Someone like me. Someone exactly like you," he said. She was, in her notes, rather specific about the profile. A woman who works with historical texts, who notices the things other researchers treat as peripheral, who follows a thread past the point where it becomes uncomfortable. That sounds like she knew I would exist. She was, from all evidence, an exceptional intellect. I think she understood that the marker recurs in specific lineages, and she identified yours. There are records." He looked at her steadily. "Your great-grandmother's great-grandmother appears in documents from the mid-1800s. She was a healer in a small village in Wales. There are accounts of things she could do with blood injuries she could treat that should have been untreatable that suggest the marker was active in her as well." Saren thought about her mother's Sunday calls, her mother who healed from things faster than made sense, who had a scar on her palm from a bad cut that had, Saren now remembered, closed within 48 hours when the doctor had said it should have taken 2 weeks. "Does my mother have it?" she asked. "A weaker version. Not strong enough to be useful for what I need. The marker apparently concentrates every second or third generation." He looked at her. "You are a third generation." She sat with that for a moment. The kettle boiled, He got up and made tea without being asked, which she noticed, and brought it to her in a mug that said something in Welsh she couldn't quite read from the angle. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Yes, I didn't come here because I was brave. I came because I got obsessed with a puzzle, and I followed it without fully thinking through where it led, which is a pattern in my life that has caused me a number of problems. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to think I walked in here with some kind of conscious courage. I walked in here because I'm bad at stopping." He looked at her for a long moment. "The physician's notes describe the quality required in the person who finds this information," he said. "She does not call it courage. She calls it a specific inability to leave things alone." Something crossed his face then, that almost amusement again, warmer this time. She seemed to consider it a virtue. Saren wrapped her hands around the mug. The tea was good, which felt like an odd detail to be glad about, but she was glad about it anyway. "If I agree to let you try," she said carefully, "what does the process look like?" "I don't know exactly. The physician describes a ritual context, specific conditions under which the attempt should be made. Time of day, physical positioning, a period of, she calls it, acquaintance, which I interpret as the subjects needing to know each other well enough that there is no fear in the exchange." She was quite specific about the fear variable. She believed that fear changed the composition of the blood in ways that would work against the healing process. So we'd need to spend time together first. Yes, she looked at him across the kitchen table with the bread and the tea and the newspaper from 3 weeks ago. How much time? She doesn't specify precisely. Her phrasing is, until the stranger becomes known. He looked faintly uncomfortable for the first time, which was interesting. 900 years old, and the thing that made him uncomfortable was admitting he might need to simply spend time with someone. "I realize this is an unusual request. You're asking me to stay. I am asking if you would consider it." Yes, Saren thought about Edinburgh. The basement. The manuscripts. The obsessive notebook full of marginalia translations that her supervisor didn't know existed. She thought about the way this room felt like somewhere she had been trying to find without knowing she was looking. "I'll need my own space," she said. "I can't share a room. I spread out too much when I'm working, and it's better for everyone if that happens privately. And I'll need access to your library, because I'm not going to be able to sit in a castle for an indeterminate amount of time without reading. And if there are any more of those manuscripts, I want to see them." Caleb looked at her with that deep water gaze. "Yes," he said, "to all of it." She had been in the castle for 11 days before she found the room he didn't want her to find. Not that he'd told her it was off limits. He hadn't made a list of rooms or issued any warnings or done anything that would have made her more curious than she already was. He had simply shown her the east wing, and the library, and the kitchen, and the room that was hers, large, stone-walled, with a window that looked out over a valley that shouldn't have been as beautiful as it was, and hadn't mentioned anything else. But the castle was large, and she was methodical, and by the morning of the 11th day she had mapped most of it in her notebook. The way she mapped manuscripts, room by room, noting what was present and what was absent, and what didn't quite connect to what it should. The door was in the north tower. It looked like every other door in the castle, except that the handle was cold noticeably. Specifically cold in a way that the stone walls weren't, in a way that didn't have an obvious structural explanation. She put her hand on it, and it opened. The room beyond smelled like iron and something else she would later identify as old grief, which she knew was not a scientifically precise description, but it was accurate. There were 7 stones on the floor. Arranged in a line, each one had a name carved into it. In that way, you carve names when you want them to be permanent, when you are not certain what else you can offer. The carvings were in different hands, different tools, different eras. The first stone was so old the letters were barely readable. The last one was newer. 1987. The name on it was Clara Reyes, and below the name it said simply she was going to change things. Saren stood in the doorway for a long time. She heard his footsteps in the corridor behind her and didn't turn around. "I wasn't trying to pry," she said. "I was mapping the building. I map things. I know." He stopped a few feet behind her. He didn't try to close the door or redirect her attention. "You can come in." She stepped inside properly, crouched down by the first stone, and read the name, which was in a script old enough that she had to work at it. "Aldith," she said finally. 11th century? 12th, early. His voice was very quiet. She was kind. I didn't understand what the bite would do. I thought I could control it. I thought it was something I could learn. A pause. I could not. Saren moved to the next stone. "Read that name too." And this was deliberate? Building these stones? It felt like the least I could do, which I understand is an inadequate gesture in the context of 7 lives. He said it without defensiveness and without self-pity, which was somehow harder to be in the room with than either of those things would have been. But it was something. She stood up. She looked at the last stone, at Clara Reyes, at 1987, that she was going to change things. Who wrote that? On the bottom. I did. What was she going to change? Her field. She was a biochemist. She had a theory about the relationship between cellular regeneration, and it's not important now. It was important to her, and she was right, and she didn't get to prove it. His voice hadn't changed in volume or tone, and that somehow made it worse. She was the last time I believed the physician's research might work. After her, I stopped looking for a while. How long is a while? For you? 20 years. Saren turned around then. He was standing in the doorway, not crossing the threshold into the room, which she noticed. As if the room had rules, and one of them was that he only entered when he had to. "What made you start looking again?" she asked. "The symptoms worsening," he said. Practically, that was the primary reason, but also he stopped. I found a continuation of the physician's notes I hadn't found before, in a private collection in Prague. It changed my understanding of what she was describing. The blood marker she identified, I had been looking for it as a purely physiological characteristic. Something measurable, something that would appear in medical records. But her continuation notes clarified that the marker manifests in behavior as much as biology, in the specific quality of attention someone brings to the world. Saren said nothing. She described the person who would heal me as someone who reads the margins, he said. Not metaphorically. Literally. Someone whose habit of attention extends past the official text into the spaces that everyone else ignores. He looked at her. I recalibrated my search after that. How long did it take to find me after that? 3 years. She thought about 3 years of being watched without knowing she was being watched. There was something that should have been disturbing about this, and part of her registered it as disturbing. But another part, the part that had followed marginalia coordinates across 3 countries without telling anyone where she was going, understood it as the logical extension of a 700-year search, and found it difficult to sustain outrage about. "You were in Edinburgh," she said. "Several times." "Yes, did you ever come into the university building?" A very slight pause. "Once. Did you see me working?" Yes. She thought about the strange restlessness she'd felt sometimes in the archive basement, the sense of being watched that she'd put down to too much caffeine and not enough natural light. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, as if testing whether she meant it. "I'm not angry," she said, which was true and also slightly baffling to her, but true. I want to understand the full picture. I need to understand things. I know. And the way he said it quietly, without any implication that this quality was inconvenient, made something settle in her chest. The physician noted that as well, in her description. He paused. She wrote, "She will need to know everything, or she will not be able to stay." Saren looked back at the 7 stones. At the 7 names, at 900 years of grief arranged in a careful line on a cold floor. "I'll stay," she said. "I decided that on day 3 when I found the section in your library on 14th century Venetian medical texts and realized it was the most comprehensive private collection I'd ever seen." She paused. "The healing possibility is, I want to help with that too. But I'd have stayed for the library." When she turned around again, something had shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just something behind his eyes that had been braced became slightly less braced. "Dinner is at 7 if you want it," he said. "I want it," she said. "And I want to talk about the prog notes. All of them." He almost smiled. It was a near miss, but it was close. "All of them," he agreed. She learned his rhythms the way she learned manuscripts, by watching the details everyone else would have considered peripheral. He was awake at all hours, which she had expected. What she hadn't expected was that he had preferences within those hours. The hour just before dawn was when he was most still, sitting in the library or near a window, not reading, not doing anything she could label, just existing with a quality of attention that made her feel like she was witnessing something private. She tried not to intrude on those hours. He read constantly, not performatively, not the kind of reading that signaled cultivation, but with the absorbed inattention of someone for whom reading was as automatic as breathing. She would lose track of him in the castle and find him in a chair somewhere with a book open on his knee that he'd apparently picked up mid-thought and hadn't set down since. He cooked, which remained startling. Not elaborate meals, he didn't eat them, and had no stake in the result beyond functionality, but he was precise about it, in a way she recognized as the behavior of someone who had mastered something once, and did not see a reason to do it poorly. The food was always good. She told him this once, and he looked briefly unsure what to do with the information, as if compliments were an input he'd had limited recent practice receiving. He spoke 5 languages fluently that she'd identified, and probably more that hadn't come up yet. When he was searching for a word in English, he would sometimes find it in something else, first a Latin root, an Arabic construction, and she would catch the half-second where he translated. Saren wrote this all down, not because she thought she needed a record, but because writing things down was how she understood them. On day 14, she found him in the library at 2 a.m, standing at the window instead of reading, and she could tell from the quality of his stillness that something was different. She poured herself water from the jug on the table and sat in the chair nearest the window without asking if that was all right, because they were past the point where that kind of asking made sense. "Worse tonight?" she asked. A pause. Then, yes. She'd asked him to describe the wound objectively, medically, in the first week, and he'd done so with the precision of someone who had had 900 years to observe their own symptoms. The wound itself had closed in the sense that it no longer bled externally. What continued was something internal, a drain on whatever sustained him, slow and constant, like a leak in a structure that had been managing the water loss for centuries, but was reaching the point where managing it required more than it was possible to give. "The physician's notes say the attempt should happen when the wound is most active," she said. "Yes, which might mean that a night like tonight, yes." He turned from the window. His face in the lamplight was not precisely tired. He didn't have tired the way she had tired, but there was something effortful about his expression that she'd learned to read as the equivalent of it. "I'm aware of the implication. Are we ready?" she asked. By her criteria, I mean. The acquaintance condition. He looked at her for a long moment. She had noticed over the past 2 weeks that he looked at her differently than he looked at other things. When he looked at the books he was reading, he was processing. When he looked at the fire, he was somewhere else. When he looked at her, he was present, in a way that felt very specific, and that she had been carefully not examining too directly, because it made something in her chest do things she hadn't allocated space for. "I think so," he said. "The question is whether you believe that." She thought about it honestly. She was good at honest assessment of her own states. It was one of the more useful things about being the kind of person who had spent her career in archives. You learned to separate what the record actually said from what you wished it said. She was not afraid of him. She had examined this carefully on several occasions and could not locate fear in any meaningful sense. What she felt in his presence was heightened, alert, the specific awareness of being in proximity to something rare, the way she felt handling a manuscript that had survived things that should have destroyed it. "I'm not afraid," she said, "but I'm nervous," which isn't the same thing. Nervous is just anticipation that hasn't resolved its valence yet. He looked at her with that expression she'd started to think of as his listening expression, the one where he was very fully attending to exactly what she'd said, and not constructing his response yet. "I'm nervous as well," he said. This surprised her enough that she didn't immediately respond. 900 years, he continued. 7 people. I have spent a very long time believing this was not possible. Finding evidence that it might be does not automatically restructure that belief. "You're afraid it won't work," she said. "I'm afraid," he stopped. Started again. "I'm afraid it will work, and I've brought you here under these circumstances, and Calum." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, with the weight on the first syllable. "If it doesn't work, I mean if the worst outcome happens, that was my choice. I followed the coordinates. I came through the unlocked doors. You told me the risk honestly on the first night, and I am still here 14 days later because I decided the information you'd told me was sufficient to make a decision. The physician said I know what the physician said. I've read her notes now. All of them." She set down her glass. She believed the marker would protect me. She had solid theoretical reasoning for that belief. She was, based on everything I've read, a more rigorous scientist than most people who came after her with better equipment. I trust her methodology. He was quiet. "Also," Saren said, "you're standing there at 2 a.m. looking like a man who has been managing a structural failure alone for 900 years, and I find that very difficult to sit across from without wanting to do something about it." So, the words came out more plainly than she'd meant them to. She watched something shift in his expression, something that moved fast and then got very carefully contained. "That's not I wasn't trying to say that to be," she started. "I know," he said. Quietly, "I know what you meant." She looked at her hands. He looked at the window. Outside the valley was dark and still. "The physician said before dawn," she said finally. "The hour when the wound is most active and the blood is most," she described it as, "awake." The blood being awake. "Yes, that's now, isn't it?" "Yes." Saren stood up. She was, she discovered, steadier than she'd expected. There was the nervousness, yes, the anticipation without valence, but underneath it something that had been building for 14 days of dinners and library hours and conversations that went until the light changed. "Then, we shouldn't wait," she said. He brought her to a room she hadn't found in her mapping. Not because it was hidden, just because it was small and unremarkable from the outside, and she'd logged the door as a cupboard without trying it. Inside it was the size of a large wardrobe, stone-walled, with a floor that had a circular pattern inlaid in darker stone, the physician's ritual geometry, which Saren recognized from the sketches in the notes. There was nothing else in the room. No furniture. No decoration. Just the circle and 2 candles on the floor at its edges that Calum lit with a match. Not with anything supernatural. And she found that detail grounding. She described the position, he said. "You standing at the circle center." "Me, I've read it," Saren said. "I know." She stepped into the circle. The floor felt the same as the floor everywhere else, which was slightly reassuring. She hadn't been sure what she'd expected, something that felt charged, or humming, or significantly different. It was just stone. Calum came to stand behind her, which was what the physician had described. The bite at the throat, from behind, approached slowly. This word slowly underlined in the notes twice, which Saren had noticed and taken seriously with the subject's full awareness at every stage. "I'm going to put my hand on your shoulder," he said. "Yes," she said. His hand was cold, which she'd known it would be, but the reality of it was different from the knowledge. Not unpleasant, just very specifically real. His hand on her shoulder, the slight weight of it, the cold that had its own quality, not the cold of an inanimate surface, but the cold of something that had been a different temperature for a very long time and carried that history in it. "Are you all right?" he asked. Yes, she was. Genuinely. "Are you?" A pause. "I don't know," he said, and the honesty of it made her trust him more than any reassurance would have. She could feel him behind her, not touching except for the hand on her shoulder, but present that specific quality of presence that she'd been aware of since the first night. The sense of something very old and very concentrated existing in close proximity. "If it hurts," he started. The physician said it won't. Not in the way I'd expect. The physician had never done this with a living subject. She was working theoretically. She was working with exceptional rigor theoretically, Saren said. There's a difference. Something in his posture, which she couldn't see, but could feel through the point of contact at her shoulder, shifted, that almost amusement that she'd come to look for. "Ready," she said, not a question. He moved his hand from her shoulder to the side of her neck with a deliberateness that was its own kind of answer. His fingers were gentle in a way that was, she hadn't prepared herself for gentle. She had prepared herself for controlled, for careful. Gentle was different. "Saren," he said. Yes, just that. Just her name. The way he said it was not the way he'd said it the first night, when it had been acknowledgement. It was something else. She filed the distinction away to examine later. Then his teeth found the curve of her throat. She had braced for pain, and what she got instead was not nothing, but not pain. The physician had called it a release in her notes, and Saren had thought she understood what that meant, and found she'd understood it only academically. Actually experiencing it was different. Like something that had been held under pressure for a long time being allowed to open. Her knees didn't buckle. She'd been worried about that. They didn't. What happened instead was that she became very precisely aware of her own heartbeat, and then aware that there was something answering it from the point of contact, a rhythm that was not her own, old and slow and immensely tired, like a piece of machinery that had been running on almost empty for longer than machinery was meant to run. She thought, Oh, I can feel it. The wound. She hadn't expected to feel his wound. The physician's notes hadn't said anything about that, but it was unmistakably there, a dragging, pulling sensation, not in her own body, but adjacent to it, the sense of something reaching toward something that it had been reaching toward for 900 years, and finding it finally close enough to touch. She didn't know how long they stood in the circle. Time did something different in that room. In that moment, not stopped, not extended, just became less linear than it usually was. She was aware of the candle flames and the cold floor, and the slight weight of his presence behind her, and the slow, steady contact at her throat. And underneath all of that, the sensation she had no words for. The sense of something beginning to close. Then he stepped back. She turned around. His face was, she didn't have a category for his face. He had one hand pressed to his side where the wound was, and he was looking at that hand, and then he looked up at her, and his expression was the expression of someone who has been very carefully not hoping for something for an extremely long time, and has just received information that may require that to change. "Are you?" she started. "I don't know yet," he said. "It needs time." He looked at her face, her throat, where she could feel something that would probably become a bruise but was currently just warmth. "Are you all right?" "Truthfully, yes," she said. Truthfully, you went very still. I could feel it, she said. Your wound. From inside the contact somehow. I could feel what it felt like. He looked at her for a moment. That's not, he stopped. The physician doesn't describe that. No, she doesn't. He was quiet. She watched him process this information, the slight shift in his eyes, the way his attention moved through it methodically. Then, are you certain? I'm certain of what I experienced. I don't know what it means. She paused. It felt very old, and very tired, and like it had been waiting. Something moved across his face then, not the almost amusement, and not the careful blankness, and not the deep water assessment she'd catalogued. Something she didn't have a name for yet, because she hadn't seen it before. He sat down, not in a chair because there were no chairs, just down, on the floor of the circle, with the kind of controlled descent that suggested his legs had made a unilateral decision. She sat down too, across from him, within the circle, in the candlelight. They stayed there while the hours passed, while something, slowly, began to change. By the time dawn came, they had moved to the library, not to do anything in particular. They had simply by unspoken agreement not wanted to stay in the small room, and the library was where they both went when they needed to think. And thinking was very much what the next several hours required. Calum sat with his hand pressed to his side intermittently, checking, the way you checked a wound to see if it had stopped bleeding. Each time he did, Saren watched his face for the result, and each time he looked not better. Not yet, but different, like something that had been certain about its own state for 9 centuries was becoming less certain. Describe it, she said, around 6 in the morning. What you're feeling. He considered this. The drain, he said slowly, has always had a quality of direction, like water moving continuously in one direction. For 900 years I have been aware of it as a constant. Like tinnitus, it's simply always there. He paused. It is not as directional right now. Is that good? I think so. Yes, I think that might be. He stopped. I don't want to say it. Why? Because I've had moments before. Moments where something seemed to change and then didn't. And the aftermath of believing and then not. He stopped again. You don't have to be certain, she said. You can just observe what's true right now without having to know what it means yet. He looked at her. You're good at that. I work with incomplete records. You learn to sit with uncertainty without forcing it into a conclusion. Something settled in his expression. Yes, he said. That's yes. Right now. In this moment. It is less directional than it has been. Good, she said simply. They were quiet for a while. Outside the library windows, the sky was doing the thing it did here. That particular movement from dark to the gray-blue that preceded actual sunrise, the light arriving before the source of it. I owe you an apology, Calum said. Saren, who had been watching the sky, looked at him. I brought you here under circumstances that I presented the situation as more certain than it was, he said. The physician's notes suggested the marker would protect you. I told you this. What I did not tell you was that I had spent 2 months constructing every possible reason that might be true, because I needed it to be true. And there is a significant difference between honest belief and motivated reasoning. She thought about this. Did you think it was safe? I believed it was. But I believed it in part because I needed to. That's honest, she said. Telling me that now is honest. It should have been honest before. Yes, she said. It should have. But you're telling me now. She paused. If it had gone badly, if I'd been hurt, how would you have managed that? He was quiet long enough that she knew he'd thought about it. Poorly, he said at last. I would have managed it very poorly. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the arriving light, and his face in the gray blue of it was so precisely tired and so precisely honest that something in her chest did the thing she'd been carefully not letting it do for 19 days. "Calum," she said. "Yes, this is when we know what the outcome is. When there's enough time passed that we can assess properly." She paused. "I'd like to stay for a while longer. Not because of the research. Just because she stopped." "Because?" He said quietly. "Because I think you've been alone for a very long time in a way that's different from simply not having company. And I think I've been alone in a way that's also different from simply not having company. And I'd like to see what happens when we're not." She looked at her hands. "If that's something you'd want." Silence. The particular silence that had weight. "I don't entirely know how to want things in the ordinary sense," he said. "I have been wanting one specific thing for 900 years, and everything else has been peripheral to it. I'm not certain I have practiced the other kind of wanting enough to be good at it." "That's all right," she said. "I've been told I'm very bad at the ordinary kind of wanting, too. Apparently it's not normal to find someone more attractive because they write detailed notes in the margins of books they're reading. You find that your copy of the 14th century Venetian medical texts has 427 marginal annotations." I counted. He looked at her. The almost amusement was all the way amusement now, actually arriving for once, and it changed his face so completely and so suddenly that she had to look away for a second and collect herself. 428, he said. "You missed one. Inside the back cover." She laughed. It came out slightly unsteady, and she didn't try to clean that up. He reached out then, across the space between their chairs, and put his hand over hers, on the arm of the chair, with a deliberateness that she understood was its own kind of statement, not an accident, not an impulse, a decision. Cold hand over her warm one, and she turned her palm up and let his fingers settle between hers. The light outside the window was properly gold now. Neither of them moved. 17 days after the ritual, Calum pressed his palm flat against his side and then held it up in the lamplight and looked at it for a long moment. "What?" Saren asked from across the table. She had been translating the Prague notes into a cleaner English copy, organizing them chronologically, a project he had not asked for, but had not objected to. "It's quieter," he said. She set down her pen. "Quieter how?" "The direction has it's not gone, but it's like the difference between a sound that fills a room and a sound you have to try to hear." He looked at her. "It's working." She didn't say anything for a moment. She was aware that this was the kind of moment that called for something significant, and was also aware that she had never been good at performing significance on demand. What she felt was complicated relief that was enormous, satisfaction of the professional variety, because the physician's methodology had held, and underneath both of those something quieter and more personal that she was still finding the edges of. "That's good," she said. "Yes," he sounded faintly stunned. "It is." The physician estimated 3 to 4 weeks for the initial closure. We're at 17 days, so you're slightly ahead of her projected timeline. She picked up her pen again. "I'm going to add that data point to my notes." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you going to respond to this clinically?" he asked, not unkindly. "I'm going to respond to this both clinically and the other way," she said. "Sequentially, the clinical part is first because it's easier. And the other way?" She put her pen down properly this time. Looked at him across the table. "I'm very glad," she said simply, not just as someone invested in the outcome of a 700-year research project. "As the other thing." "The other thing," he repeated. "The person whose hand you've been holding at approximately 9 in the morning every day for a week." He had started this without comment on day 21 of her stay. She had been sitting in the kitchen reading, not waiting for anything in particular, and he had come in at the hour before the pre-dawn quiet, and sat across from her, and after some time had put his hand on the table, and she had put hers next to it, and they had both read their separate books for 2 hours. The next morning he'd done it again. By the third morning it was simply the thing that happened at that hour, without discussion, without labeling. "That person," he said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment, in a way that she'd learned to read as processing rather than avoidance. "When I said I didn't know how to want things in the ordinary way," he said, "I meant it, but I am learning that the mechanism is less unfamiliar than I thought." He looked at her steadily. "I am aware of you constantly, not in a surveillance sense, in the sense that the room is different when you're in it than when you're not." "I know," she said. "I'm the same. I don't have good language for this. I have very good language for many things, but this is a domain where my vocabulary is genuinely limited." "That's all right." She gathered her papers into a neat stack. "We don't have to have language for it right now. We can just have the fact of it and give it time to develop its own terms. You're remarkably patient for someone who catalogs and categorizes everything," he observed. "I'm patient about things I'm interested in, and impatient about things I don't care about. This is in the first category." Something crossed his face, the thing she still didn't entirely have a name for, the expression she'd first seen in the ritual room. She was getting better at reading it, not mapping it onto any existing category, but just recognizing it as specifically his, as a face he made when something reached him past the controlled exterior and he hadn't fully prepared for it. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her to the east wing, to a room she'd mapped as apparently empty. It was almost empty. One table, one lamp, and on the table, a flat leather case. He opened the case. Inside were pages. Careful, dense pages in a hand she recognized immediately. "These are the physicians," she said, "her personal journal, not the manuscripts those were for dissemination. This was private." He looked at it. "I found it in the same collection as the prog notes. It took me some time to decide whether to show you." "Why?" He pointed to a passage near the front of the journal. She leaned over the table and read. The physician had written, in her 14th century hand that Saren parsed automatically, "I have seen her. Not her in truth, she has not been born yet. But in the casting I use to trace lineage forward, I have seen the shape of her. She is not what I expected. She will go to him not from duty or from fear, or from any of the ordinary human reasons people move toward danger. She will go because she cannot leave a thing half understood. He has waited 9 centuries. She will not make him wait much longer. And when she comes, I think the wound will not be the only thing that heals." Saren straightened up. "She knew," she said. "Yes, she knew I'd come, and she knew she stopped. She knew more than just the blood marker. Apparently, she looked at the journal, at the careful, dense pages, at 700 years of someone else's certainty sitting in a leather case on a table in a room that had been almost empty, waiting. That's a lot of responsibility," she said finally. "Being a part of someone's 700-year prediction. Yes," he paused. "I thought about not showing you. Because it changes the nature of your choice knowing someone anticipated it. It doesn't change my choice," she said. "It just tells me someone was paying attention." She looked at him. "People have been paying attention to you for a very long time, Calum, trying to help you. Building stones, writing notes in margins for someone they'd never meet." She closed the leather case gently. "You've been alone, but you haven't been without people." He looked at the case. "No," he said finally. "I suppose not." She put her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own. The 35th day brought snow. Saren discovered this by waking up to a light quality. She didn't recognize the particular flat brightness that happened when the world outside had gone white, and going to her window to find the valley transformed. The dark valley floor was covered, the tree lines blurred with it, the morning sky a pale gray that sat above everything like held breath. She stood at her window for a long time before going downstairs. She found him in the kitchen, which was where he was when the pre-dawn quiet had recently shifted into actual morning. He had made tea without being asked, which was something he'd started doing on day 12 and she'd never commented on, because commenting on it would have made it self-conscious, and she preferred it unself-conscious. She took the mug and sat at the kitchen table and said, "I need to call my mother." He looked up from the book he was reading. "I've been gone for 5 weeks," she said. "I told my supervisor I was at a conference. I've been sending emails from my phone that say everything is fine and that the conference is extended. My mother calls on Sundays, and I've been answering, and she can always tell when something is different, and I've been telling her nothing is different." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I'm not good at lying. I don't have the sustained attention for it." "What will you tell her?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Something true that doesn't require me to explain the parts that are complicated." She looked at him. "Which is most of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You could tell her you found something worth staying for," he said. "That's true." She looked at him. He was looking at his book, not at her, with the slight deliberateness that meant he was aware of having said something that landed. "That's true," she agreed. She called her mother from the east, facing window where the snowlight was best, and her mother picked up on the second ring, because her mother always picked up on the second ring, and said, "You sound different," which was the first thing she said, before hello or how are you, and Saren said, "I found something," and her mother said something, or someone, and Saren said both, and her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you all right?" And Saren said, "I'm really all right, actually," and meant it. After she hung up, she went back to the kitchen and found Caleb had moved to the window, looking at the snow. She knew immediately, Saren said. "Mothers often do," he said, and there was something in the way he said it distant. Factual. Someone reporting about a thing observed across centuries rather than experienced that told her something she filed carefully away. "Did you have?" she started, and stopped. "Parents," he said. "Yes, before. It was a long time ago." He looked at the snow. "My mother had a quality of attention similar to yours. I have thought about that. Similar how?" "She read the margins," he said simply. Saren didn't respond immediately. She came to stand beside him at the window, close enough that they were adjacent without touching, the way they often were, a proximity that had its own quality now, that had accumulated meaning over 35 days of deliberate nearness. "Will you tell me about her?" she asked. "If you want to." He was quiet for a moment, that she let be quiet. Then, he told her. Small things at first, the way his mother had grown herbs along a south-facing wall and known each one by multiple names, the different names for different purposes. A sound she'd made when she was concentrating. The particular shade of green the hills had been in the country where he'd grown up, which no longer existed in the same form, which had been remade so many times since his childhood that the only version that remained was in memory. He told her things he probably hadn't told anyone in a very long time. She could tell by the way he was careful with them, the care of someone who had held something fragile for so long that they'd learned to handle it differently from other things. She listened. She did not try to fill the silences. She understood, from working with records, that the way a person told a thing was as important as the thing itself, and interrupting the telling changed both. When he finished, they were still standing at the window. The snow had continued. The valley was deeply white now. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know why he paused. I don't tell people things. You told me." Yes, he looked at his hand, which had at some point in the past few minutes found hers, which she hadn't consciously noticed until just then. "I seem to do that." "With you, I'm told I'm a very easy person to tell things to, she said. My flatmate thinks it's a character flaw. She says it makes people overlook me as a conversational partner because I seem too receptive. Your flatmate, he said carefully, is wrong. I know, Saren said. But I've never minded being overlooked. The things you find when people overlook you are usually better than the things you find when people perform for you. He looked at her then, directly, with the full weight of whatever being looked at by someone who had existed for 900 years actually felt like. Is that why you went into archives? He said. Not quite a question. That's exactly why, she said. The snow continued to fall. Outside the kitchen window, the world was very white and very still. Inside there was tea cooling in a mug and a book lying open face down on the kitchen table, and the ordinary extraordinary fact of two people standing at a window watching snow, which had happened billions of times in the history of the world and which felt, this specific morning, entirely unrepeated. Calum, she said. Yes, I think I'm going to stay, she said, past the point where the healing is confirmed. For the other reason. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was very quiet. I was going to ask, he said, but I wasn't sure I had the right. You have the right, she said. You've had it for a while. I was waiting for you to figure that out. She kissed him on the 42nd day. This felt important to establish precisely because Saren was precise about things, and also because later she wanted to be able to say, it was the 42nd day. It was mid-afternoon. There was particular light in the library. I had been trying to reach a book on the highest shelf for 4 minutes and had refused to ask for help, and then he'd gotten it for me without comment, and that was the moment I decided I had been patient long enough. He had not been expecting it. She could tell by the way he went completely still, the 900-year-old stillness, except that this version of it was different from all the others she'd catalogued, not the stillness of habit or control or restraint, but of something that had stopped, because it had been stopped by something outside itself. She pulled back slightly, gave him space to respond or not respond. He responded, not dramatically. It wasn't what she'd read in novels, not the sweeping, overwhelming thing. It was more like a wall becoming a window, which was, if anything, more affecting. His hands found her face with the deliberateness she'd come to recognize as his particular version of careful, and he kissed her back with the attention he gave everything he considered important. When they stopped, they were both quiet for a moment. 42 days, he said. I was waiting for you. I know. He looked at her. I was learning to want things in the ordinary sense, she said. I know. I was watching. Something crossed his face. You were watching. I'm a researcher. I observe. She straightened slightly. Also, you have a tell. When she searched for the right word, in conflict about something, you press the fingers of your left hand against your palm. Repeatedly, slowly, I've been watching you do it for 2.5 weeks. He looked at his left hand. I wasn't aware of that. No, you're very controlled about most things. That one got through. She looked at the bookshelf. The book I actually wanted is the third one from the left on the 4th shelf, not the one you handed me. A pause. Then, actually, laughing. A real one, not the near-miss version. The full thing, quieter than most people's laughing, but genuinely there. And it was startling and warm, and she stored the sound of it somewhere she intended to keep. I handed you what you were reaching for, he said. I was reaching in the wrong direction. Yes, he said. I noticed. She took the correct book from the shelf, sat down in her usual chair. He sat in his. Outside the library windows, the afternoon light was doing the particular thing it did in this valley, turning amber before it should, lasting longer than it should, like the landscape here had negotiated a slightly different arrangement with time. The wound, she said, still looking at her book. "Where are we?" The physician's timeline said 4 weeks for initial closure, 8 for significant healing. He settled back in his chair. "We're at 6 weeks. The direction has almost entirely stopped." She looked up. Almost, there's still a trace. But he pressed his palm briefly to his side, the gesture she'd watched for weeks. "It's faint. It feels like something that happened once rather than something still happening." "That's good," she said. Yes, he was looking at her with a particular expression. "You have done something that was not done in 9 centuries. You understand that. I followed a set of coordinates in a manuscript margin," she said. "The physician did the work. Your body did the healing. I was just you or just the person who showed up," he said, "which is, historically, the hardest part." She looked at him. He was serious. Completely. Simply serious. "I'm going to look away now," she said, "because you're looking at me in a way that makes it very hard to continue reading, and I've been wanting to read this particular book since I identified the spine 3 weeks ago." "What book is it?" She showed him the cover. He was quiet for a moment. "That's in Middle French," he said. "I know. Most people can't, I know." He looked at her. The expression, the one she still didn't quite have a name for, was fully on his face now, undisguised, and it was more than she'd seen of it before. More than in the ritual room, more than by the kitchen window in the snow. All of it present at once. She looked away before she stopped being able to. They read their books in the amber afternoon light, and the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms were quiet when the quiet was full of things rather than empty of them. After some time, he said, without looking up from his book, "Saren. Yes, I'm glad the door was unlocked." She smiled at her page. "So am I." She found the other manuscript on a Tuesday. Not deliberately, she had been reorganizing the section of the library that contained the oldest materials, a project Calum had approved with the quiet relief of someone who had wanted it done for several decades, but hadn't been able to bring himself to prioritize it. She was cataloging, boxing things by era, making notes on condition. Straightforward work. Work she was good at. The manuscript was inside a larger folio, tucked at the back in the way things got tucked when someone put them somewhere temporarily in a hurry, and then the temporary became permanent through accumulated time. It was small, 16 pages. The hand was different from anything else she'd seen in the collection. She knew within 3 paragraphs what she was reading. She read the rest of it standing at the shelving unit, because she couldn't make herself go sit down. When she finished, she stood very still for a moment, doing what she always did with new information, running it through everything she already knew, checking it against the existing record, looking for the place where it fit or failed to fit. Then she went to find Calum. He was in the north corridor with his arms crossed, looking at something through the window in the way he looked at things when he was thinking rather than actually seeing the thing in front of him. He heard her come and turned, and must have read something in her face, because the way he looked at her changed immediately. "What did you find?" he asked. She held up the manuscript. He crossed the corridor in a few steps and took it from her carefully. She watched his eyes move across the text, his face going very still in a different way from usual. He turned pages slowly. When he reached the end, he stood without speaking for a moment. "You've read this," he said. "Yes. All of it." "Yes." He looked at her. "Then, you know." Yes. What she knew was this: the manuscript was written not by the physician, but by someone who had known the physician. A colleague. A contemporary. And this colleague had written, in the careful, precise hand of someone who understood the weight of what they were committing to ink, a continuation of the physician's theory that the physician herself had never completed. The continuation described the bite's effects in more detail than anything Saren had seen, and in that detail was a piece of information the physician's notes had not contained. The healing was not a one-time event. The wound that Calum carried, the 900-year-old wound, would close with the first attempt, as the physician had predicted. But there was a secondary process. The physician had observed it in her theoretical modeling, but had not been certain enough to include it in her primary notes. Her colleague had reached the same conclusion independently, and had not had the physician's caution. The secondary process required time. Proximity. The slow accumulation of what this colleague called shared living, which Saren had translated and retranslated, and kept arriving at the same rendering. It meant, in effect, that the healing would continue, would deepen, would move from physical to something the manuscript described in terms that were less scientific and more careful. The kind of careful that meant the writer was trying to say something true that they knew would sound like something else. It meant that what had begun was not finished. You knew part of this, Saren said. The physician's notes implied it. Implied, he said, not stated. You said the physician chose her words carefully. Yes, she looked at him. He was looking at the manuscript, at the 16 pages. His expression was not the one she didn't have a name for, something more complex than that, something that had layers she was still mapping. Calum, she said. You should know, he said, that I did not bring you here for this. I didn't know this document existed. I want to be I know, she said. You were honest about what you knew and what you didn't know. I know that. And you should also know that he stopped. This doesn't change what he stopped again. She had never heard him struggle with words before. He had, in her observation, an extraordinarily reliable relationship with language. Watching him struggle was like watching someone who had always been effortlessly coordinated suddenly be clumsy. She found it, in a way she didn't try to justify, extraordinary. You don't have to say it, she said. I want to say it. He looked at her directly. What I feel for you exists separately from any process described in any manuscript. I want you to know that. I would want you here regardless of whether the healing required your continued presence. The healing is, he paused, a reason I can offer you. But it's not my reason. She absorbed this. What's your reason? She asked. He thought about it. You read the margins, he said finally. You went to a room in a strange castle, because you couldn't not. You counted 427 annotations in my copy of a medical text, and told me so without embarrassment. You carry a notebook everywhere, and the notebook has 17 different classification systems, one for each project you're running simultaneously, and you switch between them without pausing. He looked at her steadily. You are the most thoroughly yourself person I have encountered in 943 years, and I find that a pause entirely extraordinary. Saren was quiet for a long moment. I have 17 classification systems because none of them are quite right, and I haven't found the right one yet, she said. I know, he said. The right one is probably something you'll invent. She looked at the manuscript in his hands, at the 16 pages of a colleague's careful conclusions, at 9 centuries of waiting arranged neatly into a small folio that had been hiding in a larger one. I'm going to need to go back to Edinburgh at some point, she said. My supervisor is holding my position but not indefinitely, and I have a flat and a flatmate and things I said I'd do. She paused, but I'd come back. If the offer stood. The offer stands, he said immediately. Indefinitely, I might bring boxes, she said. If I'm going to properly reorganize this library, it requires resources I don't currently have on site. I'll have them ready, he said. She nodded once. Practical, settled. Then she reached over and took the manuscript back from him, held it carefully, looked at the pages. I'm going to catalog this today, she said. Properly, with provenance notes and condition assessment. It deserves to be documented. Yes, he said. It does. And then I'd like dinner, if that's all right. "That's all right," he said. She turned to go back to the library, stopped without turning back. "Calum, yes, I'd come back because of the library and the research," she said, "but mostly for the other reason." She heard him exhale. "Not dramatic, just real. I'll make sure the kettle's on," he said. She went back to the library and cataloged the manuscript, and it took 3 hours, and they were 3 of the most satisfied hours she'd had in a long time, which told her something she was glad to know about herself. She came back on a Thursday, 2 months after she'd left, which was longer than she'd planned, but shorter than she'd feared. The Edinburgh logistics had taken time. Her supervisor, who was not a demonstrative person, had expressed something in the vicinity of concern, and something in the vicinity of curiosity, and ultimately something in the vicinity of understanding, which was the most she'd expected from him. Her flatmate had helped her pack with a speed that suggested she'd been waiting for Seren to do something like this for years. The gate was unlocked. It was always unlocked. She had come to understand this as a policy, not an oversight. She had 3 boxes in the car, and a bag on her shoulder, and a notebook with 2 new classification systems she'd been developing on the train. And she stood in front of the castle for a moment before going in, looking at the stone and the windows, and a thin thread of smoke from the kitchen chimney. She had thought, on the way, about whether it would feel different coming back, whether the accumulation of Edinburgh, the ordinary air of ordinary places, her ordinary life conducted in its ordinary rhythms, would put distance between herself and the 42 days that had preceded it. Whether she would arrive and find that it had contracted in some way, become smaller or stranger or less certain than it had felt inside it. She pushed open the front door. He was in the corridor, not waiting at the door. That would have been too much for both of them. He was in the corridor because that was the direction from the kitchen, and the kettle had presumably just been put on, and he had the controlled unhurriedness of someone who had been listening for the sound of a car for several hours, and was now performing not having been listening. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You brought boxes," he said. "I said I would. I had shelves cleared." He glanced at the bag on her shoulder, the car visible through the open door. "3 boxes. I pared down. I'll get them," he said. I'll get them," he said simply, and went past her out the door, and she watched him carry all 3 boxes inside with the ease of someone for whom physical effort was not a meaningful variable, and something settled in her chest that had been slightly unsettled since she'd gotten into the car in Edinburgh. She went to the kitchen. The kettle had indeed been put on. She made the tea the way she'd learned to make it here, which was slightly different from how she'd made it before, and she was standing at the counter when he came in and set the boxes by the door. He looked at her making tea in his kitchen like it was something he was deliberately not reacting to. She appreciated the deliberateness. "How's the wound?" she asked. Almost entirely resolved. He sat at the kitchen table, in his chair. "There are days I don't notice it at all." The colleague's manuscript suggested the secondary process would be ongoing for some time. "Yes," he looked at his hands. "It doesn't require anything particular. Just shared living," she said. "Yes." She brought 2 mugs to the table. His was mostly for form. He drank it slowly, and she suspected more out of the ritual of it than need, and sat across from him, in her chair, which was her chair now in the way that things become yours, through the simple accumulation of use. She pulled her notebook from her bag and set it on the table. "I developed 2 new classification systems on the train," she said. "Show me," he said, and meant it. She showed him. They were there for an hour, at the table, with the tea going cold and the afternoon light moving across the stone floor in its particular way, and he asked questions that were good questions, the kind that pushed the system somewhere she hadn't thought to push them, and she argued back, and he argued back, and by the end the systems were better than when they'd started. This, she thought, was what the physician had meant. The colleague's careful phrasing. Shared living. Not the dramatic version. The real version. Sitting at a kitchen table improving classification systems with someone who understood why the work mattered, who had been improving systems of various kinds for 9 centuries, and brought that practice to every conversation. "Calum," she said, when they had run through both systems thoroughly. "Yes, I'm staying," she said. "Not I'd like to stay, or I plan to stay, or any version that left the door open. Just the fact of it." He looked at her. All of it in his expression, everything she'd spent 2 months being glad she knew. "Yes," he said. "Good. I'll need to make a trip back to Edinburgh periodically. For work, and I'd like to meet your..." She stopped, because he didn't have people in the ordinary sense, and reconsidered, for us to exist occasionally in the world rather than entirely in the castle. "Agreed," he said. "And I want a shelf in the library for my own materials. A proper one, not a temporary space. I've already cleared one," he said. She looked at him. "You cleared it before I said anything. The section of shelving you've been using is insufficient for your work," he said, with the perfect composure of someone pretending they had not been thinking about this since she left. "I noticed that before you went back to Edinburgh. You cleared me a shelf," she said. "Third wall, north side, 4 shelves from the bottom. It has better light than your current location." She looked at the table, at the notebook with its 2 new classification systems, at the mug of cold tea, at the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being in the exact right place. "The physician wrote," she said, "that the healing would be complete when the person who carried the marker stopped thinking of the cure as the reason they stayed." "Yes," he said quietly. "She did. I stopped thinking of it as the reason about 5 weeks in." She looked at him, in case you were wondering when. He reached across the table, his hand over hers, cold over warm, the way it had been since the morning after the ritual, and she turned her palm up and let his fingers settle in. Outside the kitchen window, the valley light was doing what it always did, making its particular arrangements with time, lasting slightly longer than it should, going golden before it needed to. Snow still on the higher ground, the castle quiet around them. 943 years of one thing. And now, beginning to be something different. She thought about the physician in the 14th century, scattering her notes in margins no one was supposed to read, trusting that someone would come. She thought about all 7 names on all 7 stones in the North Tower room, the accumulated weight of a very long attempt. She thought about coordinates hidden in Latin prayers and a gate that was always unlocked. She thought someone very careful arranged a lot of things so that this could happen. She was glad to have been the one paying enough attention to notice. "The shelf," she said. "North wall, 3rd section south." "You said north, but you meant south. The north wall is structural." A pause. "South wall," he said. "Yes, you're right." She picked up her notebook. "I'm going to go establish myself in the library," she said. "I'll find it." She got up from the table, got as far as the kitchen door. "Saren," he said. She turned. He looked at her from across the kitchen, from his chair at the table, with the window light behind him, and 9 centuries of careful waiting in his face, and something new in his eyes that was still finding its shape. "Welcome back," he said. She smiled. Properly, fully, the kind that made her squint slightly at the corners. "I'll see you at dinner," she said. She went to find her shelf. It was exactly where he'd said. It was south wall, 3rd section, 4 shelves from the bottom, better light, and there was nothing on it yet, and there was room for everything she'd brought and would bring. And she stood in front of it for a moment, with her hand on the empty wood. Then she opened her bag and started to fill it.